With Yossi Mekelberg in London. He's a senior consulting fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. Thank you so much for joining us, Yossi. We appreciate your time. Do you think that this is the ceasefire deal that Netanyahu wanted, or was he strong-armed by Donald Trump into taking it?
Thank you for having me. It's not the ceasefire that Netanyahu wanted. How do we know that? Because he was exactly saying that such a deal is disastrous for Israel, and some of his supporters in the media or in the Israeli parliament, in government, were very much opposing it. This is something that Trump imposed, and rightly so, on Netanyahu. It's still, even despite this, it's not a perfect agreement for either of the sides, but the most important thing, it will end the war, it will end the bloodshed, something probably that should have taken place many months ago.
But this is what many analysts believe could happen. Once those hostages are all returned to Israel, would it then allow Netanyahu and his defense minister to say, we'll continue the war in Gaza?
Well, much of it depends on the United States and the other countries that are sort of guarantors of this agreement, to ensure that this Israeli government won't find any excuse to renew the war. And that's why, the involvement of President Trump, some expect him actually to come to the region, including to Israel, and give a speech in Parliament. So I think if something along these lines happen and there is a violation, as was the case in March this year, I think the Washington will have something to say about that. I think it's less likely now. We know that also the Israeli public is against renewing the war. For many months, it set as a priority to release the hostages, to end the war. As we know in politics, everything can happen, and Netanyahu's survival to a large extent depends on continuing the war. But right now the pressures, the international pressure, but also from within, probably will make it very difficult for him to renew the war.
When it comes to the Israeli public, does the ceasefire deal possibly redeem Netanyahu somewhat in the eyes of Israelis who've been so critical of his administration, especially the hostage families?
I think the initial, as we saw it from the pictures earlier, I think initially there was some elation to see, and rightly so, to see hostages that been more than 730 something days in captivity returning home. There will be, of course, of the sadness of the return of also those who were killed in this war. But also it will lead to a time of, I hope so, of soul-searching reflection, because it was the Netanyahu government that under its watch, Hamas succeeded in this horrible attack. It's under the watch of this government, Israel conducted one of the most reckless and bloody wars in the country's history that led to its reputation in the world to be left in tatters, more isolated than ever, more criticized. So, and also leaving some of the hostages were killed in captivity, soldiers were killed, and the economy is in a bad shape. So I think that's what Netanyahu was afraid, the end of the war, and then will be demand also of investigating state inquiry into the war. And anyhow, within the next year, elections are due to be held.
And when it comes to elections being held, will Netanyahu and his coalition survive a possible election? I understand that no Israeli leader has actually won another election or stayed in power after a war has been fought.
And definitely if there is a state inquiry, which is very difficult to see any state inquiry that won't find Netanyahu responsible for the failure of October 7 and many other failures before and after. And we see also in public opinion polls, Israeli public might not be that excited about some of the alternatives in the opposition, but they still prefer the opposition over the coalition. Israel needs desperately election. The hope is that it won't take another year until election, but there will be pressure from within to have an early election that will see a new government. Israel needs it desperately in order to move on from the last 2 years.
You mentioned earlier the increasing isolation that Israel is feeling, how many Israelis are struggling to even travel without being criticized for being Israeli, for the ongoing war, what many have described as a continued genocide in Gaza. Obviously, that is something that concerns the public, but are they fully aware of what it is that the rest of the world sees via our television screens or on our phones, of the famine in Gaza, of the continued attacks, of the narrative that is coming out of Gaza, what we continue to hear from Palestinians? Or is that type of narrative very different to what people in Israel hear and their government's justification for the continued attacks on Palestinians in Gaza and the occupied West Bank?
I think to a large extent the government did its best that Israelis won't be exposed to the kind of images that we have seen, the horrific images in Gaza. But I think also many Israel enter into sort of willful denial about what happened there. And so everything that happened in October 7 is justification. Which is quite tragic for the country itself, because I think had they been more aware, maybe there would have been also more demand to stop the war. And I think I hope that will come a time of reflection on this too, how this was allowed to happen, that so many civilians were killed, including children, or starvation in Gaza was allowed to happen by this government, and Israelis didn't take to the streets. But they were more concerned about the hostages, ending the war, than actually concerning about what happened in Gaza. But again, as these things in the middle of the war, they are very, very unfortunate. That I think this will really time of reckoning to go and see to what direction of isolation in the international community this government has led Israel into.
Absolutely, a time of reckoning you speak about. Do you think once this war actually does end, that Israel will allow international journalists, maybe even their own journalists, to actually go into Gaza to see what has happened there, to speak to people there? We, of course, have been speaking to journalists every day who are inside Gaza, would tell us of the horror they witness, of their own loss, of the famine they experience themselves. But it seems to hit different when it's Western journalists who go into the enclave to report on these stories.
I think we need actually now to mention the bravery of so many Palestinian journalists that kept reporting from Gaza, and so many of them lost their life in reporting. You know, they wanted the world to know the truth, which is the role of all those who deal with journalism. At the end of the day, the minute that Israel withdraw, in order to withdraw even to the yellow line, journalists will enter into Gaza. And eventually, at the end of the day, in the 21st century, you can't hide forever what's taking place. At the end of the day, there will be journalists from the West that will enter from everywhere in the world, will come and see what, the devastation of Gaza. They will hear evidence from among Gazan people. And yes, one day, I think also Israeli journalists will come and report too. How long it will take, I don't know. But even during the war, despite all the restriction, we knew enough to want this war to come to an end. As time will go by and the ceasefire hold, we'll know even more.
And Yossi, just finally, I am wondering if once this war does come to an end, if it will change in any way the way Israel conducts its actions towards other countries in the Middle East it views as a threat, the continued attacks on Lebanon, as well as Iran and Yemen. Do you think those will also come to an end, or they'll continue?
I think the situation will calm down. We have also to remember that in case of Hezbollah, it's the one that initiate launching an attack on Israel, and Iran supported Hezbollah all along. And then the attack on Syria is very different because Israel is the one that decided actually to take more land, the Syrian part of the Golan Heights. So there are different fronts and different stories there. But the hope is that the ceasefire will lead to calm down all the fronts, but also that the international community will stay focused and pay attention to all of these fronts and understand that until all the root causes of this conflict are addressed, there is always dangers of further flare-ups.
Absolutely. Yossi Mekelberg from Chatham House, it's been great to speak to you and get your analysis. Thank you very much.